Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening. If you can hear me, I hope you can, because I'm really just testing this out. I'm not sure if it is actually working correctly. So I'm really just playing around with this right now. But I was interested in it. Like I told you, I like to read and I like to look at things. From past to present, and I like to really envelop myself in things that have happened, things that are happening that are current events even now. Good things and some things that explain the reason why people believe some of the things they believe, the reason why the government is being run the way it is, why people experience experiences that they are facing even as of today. And I believe the past usually will shape the present, and it is truly so. So, with that being said, I went to a site and it was called Equal Justice. I'm looking at it right now. So, if you are looking at my screen, I'm pulling it up. So, it is a site. Um, I'm trying to go on here because it's an abbreviation. It's called Equal Justice Initiative. I want you to be able to see what it is that I'm looking at. And rather than just reading things and you don't know if it's real, if it's something made up or false, because I would like for people to be able to, um, people are so into whether things are fake or whether things are real or creditable. And if a person is, just making things up, and I'm not one to get on line and pretend and make stories up just because it's amusing. I really am reading from articles. Sometimes they come from the LA Times, Pew Research, and they could come from various sites, but I'm reading something and I try to get things that are more closer or truer to what is going on in this world today, what has happened before, and what impact it has on people as a whole. And so this site is Equal Justice Initiative, which is committed to ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the U.S., to challenging racial and economic injustice, and to protecting basic human rights for the most vulnerable people in American society. And so it has plenty of articles dealing with children in prison, mass incarceration, the death penalty, just mercy, issues involving evolution of slavery, legacy of lynching, resistance to civil rights, presumption of guilt, a lot of different issues that deal with some of the things that have been talked about in some of the videos. Um, and how it affects people as a whole. And I mentioned briefly at some of the troubles and some of the things that have happened to me in the place that I've worked. And it's happening as of right now in terms of, like in real time, like, this is Sunday. People go back to work Monday through Friday and it starts all over again. And so the weekend you have a little bit of downtime, you can kind of regroup and relax a little bit. You feel comfortable and you're well rested that you're away, but you always have in the back of your mind that I'm just going to make it until I can find something better, find some better staff or better coworkers to work with that are not taking things personal. And I don't know if I mentioned that ever since we had the election back in November when Donald Trump was elected as president, people started to act, even in my workplace, people started to act suspicious. They acted funny. People were asking people, there was one person at my workplace was asking who people voted for. There was also violence or threats from just people. You would hear about people if they had a bumper party, or if you voted for somebody, somebody didn't like you, or and then you got a negative reaction, or and people were afraid to say who they voted for because you're afraid of backlash. So these same things were happening in the place where I work. And so what resulted in that, ever since that foot, I'm not really into sports that much. I know of sports, but I'm not a big sports fan where I'm religiously watching sports continuously. But the football player Kaepernick, um, Kaepernick, when he started kneeling for the Pledge of Allegiance, it created a windstorm of controversy. And so it is even impacted his career to where he's not able to play anymore. And it just goes to show you that some things never really change. And so what I did notice um, behind all of this, I was looking on a site here, which is, if I go down, it talks about the legacy of lynching. And so this woman, what she does is, ever since Kaepernick was on television and all these people were on television talking about how they didn't like that he was kneeling for the flag, it has come to my workplace. And so we can't do anything. I mean, we could go out and say the Pledge of Allegiance with a group of people, and if one or two people are not there, we have to wait until those people come, and then that Pledge of Allegiance has to be said. So what I have found myself doing is I don't put my hands on my heart. I don't really say it. I just stand there. I sort of get silent, and I don't participate 100% in the Pledge of Allegiance. I participate, but I don't participate 100% because I don't has been treated fair and equal in American society. And even till now, we're seeing a lot of things, or have seen a lot of things more recent that have not. And so I'm going to read portions of these things that I found interesting. I will do this again. So it goes on to talk about the legacy of lynching in this country, in America, that after the end of slavery and the premature end of the Reconstruction period, Southern whites who had fought to keep slavery regained power of their state governments. The convict leasing and sharecropping systems were used to restore white economic dominance, and discriminatory laws that deprive Black people of political rights. Violent intimidation was a method. And so it goes on to offer me to read more. That lynching emerged as a vicious tool of racial control in the South after the Civil War, as a way to reestablish white supremacy and suppress Black civil rights. At the end of the 19th century, Southern lynch mobs targeted and terrorized African Americans with impunity. Lynching of African Americans was terrorism, a widely supported phenomenon used to enforce racial subordination and segregation. Lynchings were violent and public events that traumatized Black people throughout the country here in America and were largely tolerated by state and federal officials. This was not frontier justice carried out by a few marginalized vigilantes or extremists. Instead, many African Americans who were never accused of any crime were tortured and murdered in front of picnicking spectators, including elected officials and prominent citizens, for bumping into a white person or wearing a military uniforms after World War I, or not using the appropriate title when addressing a white person. People who participated in lynchings were celebrated and acted with impunity, purchasing victims' body parts as souvenirs and posing for photographs with hanging corpse to mail to loved ones as postcards. Lynchings profoundly impacted race relations in this country and shaped the contemporary geographic, political, social, and economic conditions of African Americans. Most importantly, lynchings reinforced a narrative of racial indifference and a legacy of racial inequality that is readily apparent in our criminal justice system today. Mass incarceration, racially biased capital punishment, excessive sentencing, disproportionate sentencing of racial minorities, and police abuse of people of color reveal problems in American society that were shaped by the terror era. So, the Equal Justice Initiative researchers have documented 4,075 racial terror lynchings in African Americans in Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia between 1877 and 1950. At least 800 more than previously reported. In addition, for all the documented lynchings covered in the newspaper reports, many racial terror lynchings went unreported and their victims remain unknown. No prominent public memorial or monument commemorates the thousands of African Americans who were lynched right here in America. This is a powerful statement about our nation's failure to value the Black lives lost in this brutal campaign of racial violence. Research on mass violence, trauma, transitional justice underscores the urgent need to engage in public conversations about racial history that begin a process of truth and reconciliation in this country. And so that, to me, validates an important point just in and of itself, looking at that. So if you go down to news and pan down on the screen, you'll see different articles that talk about the injustices and some of the lynching victims, some of the incidents and the struggles that have happened here in America. So for those people who want to say Kapernick is wrong and that he's not respecting the flag, let me read to you this: the struggle of veterans here in America. The struggle of Black veterans, November 10, 2017. Veterans Day is an occasion to acknowledge with respect and appreciation those whom have served in the U.S. Armed Forces. But for generations, African Americans returning home from service were more likely to face discrimination, disrespect, violence, and even death. During the 19th and the 20th centuries, white supremacy remained law and the custom throughout the nation, and many whites feared that Black soldiers who had experienced the pride of the military service would resist, and they would disenfranchisement of segregation and second-class citizenship that still characterized African American experience. In August of 1917, be warned that once a Black soldier was allowed to see himself as an American hero, it would be a short step to the conclusion that his political rights must be respected. Bringing Black soldiers home to the South with expectations of equality, he predicted would inevitably lead to a disaster. So for Senator Vardman, Black soldiers' potential as community leaders was terrifying, and it was called a disaster. It would be a mass movement for African American rights. Indeed, it was. Many African American soldiers returned determined to fight for their own freedom and equality, and veterans like Hosea Williams, Medgar Evers played central roles in what became civil rights movement era. And the efforts to suppress that potential leadership made Black veterans targets. And many suffered brutal violence for protesting, mistreatment, or simply wearing their military uniforms. In August of 1898, a Black Army private named James Neely was shot to death by a mob of white men in Hampton, Georgia, for protesting a white storekeeper's refusal to serve him at a soda counter. Hickman, Kentucky, a recently discharged Black soldier named Charles Lewis was lynched in his uniform in December of 1918, just weeks after the end of World War I. Mr. Lewis was standing on the street in his uniform when a white police officer began harassing him and claimed he fit the description of a robbery suspect. When Mr. Lewis insisted that he was a soldier with no reason to rob anyone, the officer accused him of assault and arrested him. The next morning, the mob of white men broke into the jail, seized Mr. Lewis, and hanged him. Black veteran of World War II also faced violence for the most basic assertions of equality and freedom. In August of 1944, the white owner of a small restaurant in Shreveport, Louisiana, shot and wounded 4 Black soldiers he claimed attempted to take over his place. He faced no charges. Sounds familiar what we're going on today, doesn't it? In June of 1947, a Black Navy veteran named Joe Nathan Roberts, studying at a Temple University through the GI Bill, was visiting his family in Sardis, Georgia, when a group of white men became upset because he refused to call them sir. Later that night, the men abducted Mr. Roberts from his parents' home and shot him to death. The next year, September 9th, 1948, a group of white men shot and killed a 28-year-old Black veteran named Isaiah Nixon outside of his home and in front of his wife and 6 children, just hours after he defied threats and voted in the local primary election in Montgomery County, Georgia. 2 white men arrested and charged with his death were later acquitted by all white jurors. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. And then I'm going to pivot over to this area right here. Talks more in depth statement. The site features painful stories of America's history of racial injustice. In order to heal the deep wounds of our present, we must face the truth of our past. After slavery was formally abolished, lynching emerged as a vicious tool of racial control to reestablish white supremacy and suppress Black civil rights. More than 4,000 African Americans were lynched across 20 states between 1877 to 1950. These lynchings were public acts of racial terrorism intended to instill fear in entire Black communities. Government officials frequently turned a blind eye or they condoned the mob violence. The effects of racial terror lynchings are still felt today. So, to those of you that think Kaepernick is wrong for bringing up the fact that America has not resolved the issues around the terrorism that has been done to Blacks and in Black communities and throughout, and the systematic oppression that has been dealt to Black people, think again. I just thought that these things were good issues to put out there. And for those of you who are opposed, work and read. Anyway, said, when I go to work, I'm going to face that same individual who thinks that taking a kneel or not participating in saying the Pledge of Allegiance, something must be this. If you really did your homework, if you really cared, if you really are about all lives like you claim to be, then you would read this information and you would understand more that much more has to be done to resolve issues that have happened in the past that even are happening even today. They're like repeats of the past. For Black people to see Black people who get killed, gunned down, shot, beaten, this is just reopening wounds, old wounds. So I think that people, if you want to look at this site, if you're interested in trying to find out where this site is, I will leave it in the inbox below. Thanks for listening.